All right, let's go. Number 10, the Pesce canoe. A digger operator hit something dark and curved in a peat bed, didn't know what it was, and let it fall off the spoil cart. That object is now called the oldest boat on Earth. It happened in 1955 on a new road south of the village of Pesce in the Dutch province of Drenthe. A local farmer named Hendrik Wanders picked the thing up off the ground, looked at it properly, and got word to the Biological Archaeological Institute at the University of Groningen. What he'd rescued was a hollowed trunk of Scots pine, 298 centimeter long and about 45 meters across. The marks of the flint and antler tools that shaped it still legible inside. Radiocarbon puts it at roughly 8,200 to 7,500 years before Christ. 7 decades later, nothing has displaced it as the oldest boat known anywhere in the world. For most of those 7 decades, specialists refused to call it one. Sonja Anderson, one of the leading authorities on Mesolithic Scandinavia, stated flatly that it is no boat. C.N. Dubelaar, arguing from practical experience with log canoes in Suriname, said it would capsize immediately. The alternatives on the table were a feeding trough or a chest. The case had a certain logic. The hull is round-bottomed, short, crude, next to almost anything that came later, and it has a hole in it. But there were no domesticated animals anywhere in northwestern Europe in the 8th millennium BC, which leaves nothing to feed from a trough. Then somebody actually tested it. In 2001, Jaap Bucher, an archaeologist at the Drents Museum in Assen, built a copy using stone and antler axes of Mesolithic type, about 10 days' work, and put it in a fen in Drenthe. A canoeist paddled it. The result wasn't ambiguous. It floated, it handled, and the paddler was able to stand up in it, which is not something an unstable hull permits. The trough hypothesis has never recovered. Bucher didn't formally publish the experiment until 2021, 2 decades after the paddling. By then, the result had already circulated and settled the question on its own. The Pesce canoe is not a first attempt. It's a competent object, made by someone who had the finished shape clear in mind before the first cut, and it was built from a species of pine that had only just recolonized the region behind the retreating ice sheet. The nearest rival, a pine dugout from Noyen-sur-Seine in France, is roughly 9,000 years old. Both are already skilled work, and that's the part worth sitting with. These are the 2 oldest boats we have, and neither one looks like a beginning. They look like the surviving tail end of something much longer that simply rotted away. Wood doesn't last. Peat is the exception, not the rule. The only reason anyone in the Netherlands is standing in front of a hull this old is that a wet, airless bog closed over it and refused to let go. Everything else that was ever on that water is gone. Today, the canoe sits freeze-dried and stable in a display case. 3 meters of pine, a shallow trough, tool marks still legible on the inside. The label reads, "The oldest boat in the world." That's true. And it tells us almost nothing about when people actually started building them. Number 9, the Dafuna canoe. A well digger in dry Nigerian scrubland hit wood 4.5 meters down in country nobody associates with boats at all, because the sea that used to be there is gone. Northeastern Nigeria's Yobe State is dry scrub country now. Lake Chad sits about 200 kilometers away and shrinking. In May 1987, a Fulani herdsman named Malam Yaa was digging a well near the village of Dafuna when he struck timber. Preliminary work by the University of Maiduguri followed over the next 2 years. In 1994, a joint Nigerian-German team, led by Peter Brunig of Frankfurt and Abubakar Garba of Maiduguri, working with around 50 local laborers, spent roughly 2 weeks lifting it out. Nothing like it existed anywhere in the African archaeological record. Nothing close. It runs 8.5 meters long, about half a meter wide, with walls worked down to about 5 cm by stone tools bow, and a stern, both shaped to points. 2 German laboratories dated it. Cologne returned Sebemanau 264 years before present. Kiel 7,670, calibrating to a canoe roughly 8,000 years old. The wood was identified only to genus, most probably Kaya African mahogany, a caution the excavators observed that almost everyone writing about the boat since has abandoned. What makes the Dufuna canoe genuinely difficult isn't its age, it's the comparison. The Petz canoe is older by nearly 2,000 years and it's blunter, thicker, cruder. Dufuna is longer, thinner walled, and finished at both ends. Brunig's published comparison drew the obvious uncomfortable conclusion. This boat doesn't represent the beginning of a tradition. It sits well inside one. The two oldest hulls we have come from separate continents, both already mature work, with nothing underneath either of them. The landscape explains why anyone needed an 8-meter hull in what's now semi-desert. Through the early and middle Holocene, the Chad Basin held an enormous freshwater sea. Nick Drake and Charlie Bristow reconstructed Paleolake Megashad at 400,000 square kilometers or more, over 170 meters deep in places, larger than the Caspian Sea. Simon Armitage, working with Bristow and Drake, later put it at around 360,000 ners as recently as 6,000 years ago. Then the West African monsoon retreated and the lake collapsed into dunes within a few centuries. The canoe belongs to a green Sahara on the shore of an inland sea that no longer exists, built, used, and left, sealed under sediment for 8 millennia while the water drained away above it, and nothing came with it. No settlement, no cemetery, no village plan, no published pottery sequence, one hull, 8.5 mallows of shaped mahogany, and no people at all. It's held now in a museum complex in Damaturu, the Yobe state capital, in poor condition. In 2014, the heritage researcher Adaremi Adewumi wrote that 20 years after excavation, the canoe couldn't be said to be in a shape suitable for long-term preservation, and regional insecurity has made access difficult ever since. The arithmetic here is the haunting part. A lake the size of a small sea, boats working across it for thousands of years, and the entire human side of that reduced to nobody at all. Not a name, not a grave, not a hearth. There's no route left to find out who they were. Number 8. The boat under the Dover Road. 6 meters under a modern high street on the last day of a watching brief. A machine bit into timber that rewrote what the English Channel was for. For most of the 20th century, the standard picture of Bronze Age Britain went like this: an island at the edge of a continent, receiving metalwork and fashion from the south, while the channel worked as a slow filter. Contact assumed, but regular seagoing traffic in British-built vessels never proven, because nothing had ever been found that could plausibly do it. That changed on September 28, 1992, underneath a road. Archaeologists from the Canterbury Archaeological Trust watching construction on the A20 underpass at Townwall Street, Dover, were near the end of their brief when the machine exposed timber 6 meters down, sealed in waterlogged, oxygen-free silt. Keith Parfitt's field team had days left before the diggers moved on. What they lifted out was a sewn plank boat, and the joinery is the whole point. The planks were oak, split from very large straight-grained trees, worked to beveled edges and stitched together with twisted withes of yew. The seams were packed with moss, held in place by thin oak laths, locked down with oak wedges. Cleats carved from the solid plank carried the transverse timbers that stiffened the whole hull. There is no metal in it anywhere. 9.5 meters came up, about 2.25 men wide, roughly 8 tons of waterlogged oak. The northern end stayed buried under the road, and estimates of the boat's original length run anywhere from 14 to 18 mikim, still unsettled. Radiocarbon dates it to 1575, 1520 BC. A piece of Kimmeridge shale, which only outcrops on the Dorset coast some 120 nautical miles away along the coastline, was recovered with it. The chronology kept moving further up the coast. On the Humber foreshore, Ted Wright and his brother had found the first of the North Ferriby boats back in 1937. Same construction, oak planks sewn with yew, long dated to around 1300 BC. In 2001, a redating program published in Antiquity by Wright with Robert Hedges, Alex Bayliss, and Robert Van de Noort pushed them back hard. Faribault 3 came out at 2030, 1780 BC, 5 to 7 centuries earlier than anyone had thought. That correction is more unsettling than it sounds because the boats hadn't changed, only our picture of them had, and it moved half a millennium on the strength of a single dating program. Then came the serious objection. Sean McGrail, the field's most careful skeptic, argued Farabee 1 had neither the shape nor the structure for open water stability. Freeboard failed, and the seagoing reconstruction leaned on restoring parts that were simply missing. He thought hide boats did the real prehistoric seafaring. The current position is more generous and far better tested. Malcolm Wallace concluded in 2005 that full-scale vessels of this type could have crossed the North Sea, and Van de Noort pointed out that every known sewn plank boat in Britain comes from a coast, an estuary, or the tidal reach of a river. Their capabilities, he argued, had been badly underrated. Then somebody actually built one. A half-scale Dover reconstruction went into the water at Dover Marina on May 12, 2012, and took on water immediately. The launch was abandoned on the spot. The team stripped it, recaulked it, reassembled it, and relaunched at Faversham Creek in September 2013. It ran trials for a year and reached 7.8 knots. What's left is not the picture this entry started with. The channel in 1550 BC wasn't an edge. It was worked water crossed and stitched oak by people who could split a 30-centimeter plank out of a standing tree without a saw. The object that proves it spent 3,500 years 6 meters under the future high street of a ferry port. Number 7. The obsidian that crossed open ocean. A piece of black volcanic glass turns up on the Japanese mainland 38,000 years ago. It has exactly one possible source, and that source has never once been connected to the mainland by land. Something crossed open water to bring it there, and not one splinter of the vessel that did it has ever been found. The obsidian traces chemically to Kozushima, an island in the Izu chain south of Honshu, never joined to the mainland at any low sea level stand that matters. Depending how it's measured, the crossing is 30 to 50 kilometer, always water. The timing makes it worse, not better. The Upper Paleolithic on the Japanese mainland begins around 39,000 to 37,000 years ago, and the obsidian crossing is there from the very first horizon, not a later refinement once people were established, and there is nothing else. No boat, no hull, no paddle, no rope, no fragment of watercraft of any kind has ever been recovered from the Paleolithic anywhere in East Asia. So how do you test a vessel that doesn't exist? You build the candidates and see which one can actually do the job. Yusuke Kaifu and a large team spent years doing exactly that on the Taiwan to Ryukyu route, where the obstacle is the Kuroshio, one of the strongest currents in the ocean, 100 kilometer wide, running over a meter per second, and reconstructions suggest it moved even faster in the Pleistocene. The early attempts failed, and failed usefully. Reed bundle rafts drifted off target in 2016. Bamboo rafts in 2017 and 2018 topped out under a meter per second, one covering 80 kilometers in 14 hours before being abandoned just 10 kilometers short of the island, its paddlers losing control inside the current as the hull cracked and waterlogged. So they built a dugout, 7.5 meters of Japanese cedar, hollowed with replica edge-ground stone axes of a type attested in Japan from around 38,000 years ago, and named it Sujim. On July 7, 2019, 5 paddlers, 4 men, 1 woman, left Cape Wushibi on Taiwan's east coast with no compass, no charts, no watches, steering by sun, stars, and swell, spending roughly 17 of the following hours inside the Kuroshio itself. They reached Yonaguni 45 hours and 10 minutes later. What makes the result hold up is the modeling underneath it. Kaifu's group had already tested the lazy explanation, tracking 138 satellite drifter buoys, released between 1989 and 2017 to see how often passive drift alone delivers anything to the Ryukyus at all. The answer, 3 to 4%. They also established that Yonaguni is invisible from the Taiwanese coast, appearing only as a silhouette from mountains 1-200 meter up. The companion simulation is the detail that lands hardest. Aim the canoe straight at the target and the success rate collapses into single figures because the current sweeps the boat past the island. Aim roughly 75 degrees off. well to the northeast of the actual landfall, and the odds climb towards certainty. To arrive, the canoe has to point somewhere else entirely. Nobody blundered onto these islands. Somebody went looking for land they couldn't see and worked out how to steer for it sideways. An extraordinary thing to know without instruments. The authors are careful about what they have actually proven, and we should be too. Their own conclusion is that this kind of travel was possible only for experienced paddlers with advanced navigational skill, and Kaifu doesn't think a return crossing of the Kuroshio was possible at all. Demonstrating a crossing can be done isn't evidence that it was. The obsidian remains the harder fact, because obsidian isn't a hypothesis. It's a rock with a chemical fingerprint, sitting in a mainland deposit 30 to 50 kilometers from the only outcrop it could have come from. What's unsettling is the asymmetry of what survives. We have the cargo and not the vehicle. 38,000 years of black glass, cataloged and sourced and sitting in museum drawers. And not one splinter of the hull that carried it would, in a warm, wet climate, never had a chance. Number 6. The ships preserved as tar picture a lump of black bitumen the size of a matchbox, brittle and unremarkable, except that one face is stamped with the impression of bundled reeds, and the other face is crusted with barnacles that could only have grown in open seawater. That lump is the oldest evidence of a seagoing vessel on Earth, and the vessel itself is completely gone. It comes from Site H3 at Asabia, a Neolithic coastal settlement on the northern shore of Kuwait Bay, excavated by a Kuwaiti-British team led by Harriet Crawford and described by Robert Carter in Antiquity in 2006. The people there fished, gathered shellfish, and built in stone, but their pottery hadn't been made anywhere near the Im. It belonged to the Ubaid tradition of southern Mesopotamia, several hundred kilometers up the Gulf. Pottery is heavy, breaks easily, and is miserable to carry overland. Exactly the kind of cargo you load onto a boat. Before a single fragment of hull was ever identified at the site, the ceramics were already a shipping record. Then, the excavators started registering the bitumen itself. 51 pieces in total, 42 carrying impressions, mostly the parallel lines of bundled reed, 4 carrying impressions of the string or rope that tied the bundles together, and 18 with barnacles on the reverse face. Radiocarbon puts the site's occupation between 5,500 and 5,000 BC. The bitumen itself dates to 5300, 4,800 BC. Geochemistry traced the tar to Bergen, a natural surface seep in Kuwait, gathered locally, heated, mixed, and applied by hand. The barnacles are doing far more work than they look like they're doing. Carter noticed that barnacles never appear on the same face as the reed impressions, not once, across the entire assemblage. If they'd simply grown after the site sank beneath rising seas, they'd be on both faces of the slabs. They aren't. That single observation is what turns a lump of tar into a boat. The coated surface faced outward into seawater, and the reeds sat on the inside. 2 other objects from the same dig fill in the picture. A ceramic model carefully renders the shape of a reed bundle boat, its individual bundles marked in incised lines. A painted disc appears in Carter's own carefully hedged wording to show a masted boat with 2 spars resembling a bipod mast. Now, the honest limit, stated plainly, no hull survives here. No reed, no rope, no timber. What remains is the waterproof skin that was applied to the outside of something, and the something is entirely gone. Neither Carter nor the geochemists who worked the tar ever published a length or tonnage estimate. Any such figures circulating elsewhere didn't come from them. Even the broader picture isn't fully settled. Thomas Streck argued in 1996 that the Ubaid clay objects long read as the earliest sailing boat models are more likely spinning bowls used by weavers, which pulls the ground out from under the assumption that these people even had sails, and the question has never been resolved. The technique kept running for thousands of years regardless. 2.5 millennia later, 1,500 kilometers down the coast at Ras Al Jins in Oman, excavators under Serge Clouzieu and Maurizio Tosi recovered more than 300 comparable pieces in a paper titled The Black Boats of Megan. The Omani material is bigger, better preserved, and more informative. Reed impressions on one side, barnacles on the other, matte impressions on some pieces, and this time impressions of wooden planks as well, at a site that also produced Indus pottery and the richest concentration of seals anywhere on the Oman Peninsula. The bitumen itself traces to northern Mesopotamia, meaning the tar had already traveled the length of the Gulf before anyone smeared it onto a hull. The oldest known seagoing vessels on the planet survive as their own negative. The reeds rotted, the ropes rotted, and the coating hardened around the empty space and held its shape. It's a haunting way to be preserved. What sits in the museum store isn't the boat. It's the exact impression of the boat, taken from the outside in. Number 5. The canoes of La Marmota. Under a lake north of Rome sits a Neolithic village nobody was looking for, and inside it, 5 canoes built from 4 different kinds of wood. Proof that 7,000 years ago, someone was already choosing timber the way a modern boat builder would. In March 2024, a paper in PLOS One by Juan Gibaja of the Spanish National Research Council, Niccolò Mazzucco of the University of Pisa, Mario Mineo of Rome, and colleagues reset the timetable for the Mediterranean boat building using material that had already been out of the water for years. La Marmota is a Neolithic village under Lake Bracciano, found by accident in spring 1989 during pipeline work, about 300 meters offshore, under 8 meters of water and 3 meters of lake sediment, the entire village sealed beneath it. Underwater excavation ran from 1992 to 2006 under Maria Antonietta Fugazzolo del Pino. The site covers at least 2 hectares, less than a quarter of it investigated, much of what's already come up still unpublished. 5 canoes came out of it. Marmota 1, oak, 10.43 meter long, 1.15 meter across at the stern. Marmota 2, alder, 5.4 meter. Marmota 3, alder, 8.35. So Marmota 4, poplar, fragmentary. Marmota 5, beech, 9.5 minutes surviving. The dates run continuously from about 5,020 down to about 5,085 BC. 4 different tree species is the detail worth stopping on first. This isn't simply whatever logs happen to be lying around. Oak is hard, heavy, durable, and brutal to work. Alder is light, easy to cut, and resists rot in water. Poplar is light and soft. Beech is dense and splits badly. Someone was matching timber to task in the 6th millennium BC, building hulls of very different sizes from different woods at the same time. The choice itself is the evidence. And then the canoes stop being canoes and start being naval architecture. Inside Marmota 1 sit 4 trapezoidal transverse ribs. Marmota 3 has 3. Marmota 5 has 2. They aren't added afterward. They're carved from the solid trunk, meaning the builder left them standing deliberately while hollowing out everything around them. That can't be an afterthought. The reinforcement has to exist in the plan before the adze ever goes in, and it commits the maker to a hull shape he can no longer change once he started. Then there are 3 T-shaped objects, each with a pointed upper end and drilled with 2, 3, and 4 holes respectively, found inserted into the starboard wall of Canoe 1, evenly spaced. The authors don't overreach here, and neither should we. Their suggestion is that these might have anchored ropes for a possible sail or a stabilizer, or a second hull lashed alongside for a double-hulled craft. Might. That's the right register. What isn't speculative is where the rest of the village's material came from. The obsidian at La Marmota was quarried on Lipari and Palmarola. Palmarola off the coast of Lazio, Lipari off the north coast of Sicily, several hundred kilometers south. Hard stone for the axes came from the Alps. The lake itself drains to the Mediterranean via the river Aron, 38 kilometers away. No La Marmota hull has ever been shown to have gone to sea directly. The seaworthiness case leans on a modern replica, the Monoxylon II, which covered some 800 kilometers of Mediterranean coastline in 1998. Set that speculation aside, and the plain implication still stands. 7,000 years ago, on a lake in Lazio, people were running a fleet of purpose-built hulls made from 4 different woods, while volcanic glass from 2 separate offshore islands was arriving in their village. Somebody was fetching it. The real consequence isn't the canoes themselves. It's that the sea between those islands was already a route mapped in somebody's head, used often enough to be reliable. Everything that sailed that water for the following 7,000 years was traveling a road that had already been opened. Number 4. The Uluburun Wreck. A ship goes down against a cliff face off southern Anatolia at the end of the 14th century BC, and 10 tons of copper slide down the rock with it, and that cargo is the only reason there's anything left to find at all. Over the next 3,000 years, the timber was eaten away by everything that eats timber, except exactly where the metal sat on top of it and sealed it off. In the summer of 1982, a sponge diver from Yalukovac named Mehmed Chakir described metal biscuits with ears lying on the seabed near a headland called Uluburun and sketched what he'd seen. The sketch reached the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, and between 1984 and 1994, George Bass and then Semal Pulak ran 11 excavation campaigns on the site, spread across depths of 42 to 61 meters. The numbers behind that operation are worth hearing on their own. 22,413 dives, 6,613 hours on the bottom. At that depth, a diver gets about 20 minutes at a time. The entire wreck came up in 20-minute installments across 11 summers. 2 independent dating methods agree. Radiocarbon on the cedar keel and other short-lived material puts the sinking at 1320 BC, give or take 15 years. A piece of the ship's own firewood preserved tree rings running to 135, though no bark survived. So that's a floor rather than a felling date. A gold scarab bearing Nefertiti's name sets the outer limit the ship cannot predate. The hull is cedar of Lebanon, built shell first, its planks joined edge to edge with mortise and tenon joints, locked by pegs of hard oak, a heavy central plank projecting up into the hull in place of a true keel. Roughly 15 men were long. 24 stone anchors went down with it. The cargo is why the wreck is famous. 354 copper oxide ingots, 10 tons of copper in total, around a ton of tin, close to a 10.1 ratio, enough to alloy roughly 11 tons of bronze, 175 glass ingots in cobalt blue, turquoise, and lavender, around 150 Canaanite storage jars, most holding terebinth resin, half a ton of it altogether. Then the stranger, smaller things, African ebony logs, hippopotamus teeth, an elephant tusk, ostrich eggshells, Baltic amber, 9 Near Eastern cylinder seals, 120 geometric balance weights, plus 19 more shaped as animals, swords of Canaanite, Mycenaean, and Italian type, a ceremonial axe of green stone from Bulgaria, and a folding writing tablet of boxwood, 9.5 by 6 centimeter hinged with ivory. The tin is where the story turns. In 2022, Wayne Powell and a large team published an isotopic study in Science Advances of 105 tin ingots, about 91% of the ship's total tin. 2/3 traced to Anatolian sources. The remaining third traced all the way to Central Asia to the Mushistan deposit in what's now Tajikistan, roughly 3,000 kilometers inland. That reading is contested. In 2023, Daniel Berger, Kay Kohlmeyer, and Ernst Pernicka published a rebuttal in Frontiers in Earth Science, arguing tin isotopes alone aren't diagnostic, that comparable values turn up in the Erzgebirge, Cornwall, and Iberia, and that experimentally smelted Mushistan tin carries iron, copper, and arsenic at levels 3 to 5 orders of magnitude above what's actually in the ingots. Wrong mineralogy. Wrong lead isotopes. Their preferred source is southwest England. Nobody has settled it, and more disputes stack up behind that one. The ship's home port argued between the Levantine coast and Cyprus, its destination between the Greek mainland and Rhodes. Whether this was commerce or royal gift exchange left entirely open. Strip all of that away, and one fact survives every argument. Bronze needs copper and tin, and the two metals almost never occur in the same place. Every bronze blade you've ever seen behind museum glass depended on someone moving one of those metals a very long way to meet the other. That's the unsettling residue here. And it isn't an ancient curiosity, it's the same mechanism that runs a modern supply chain already fully operational, already crossing open water in a 15-meter cedar hull 300 years ago. The mechanism never stopped. Only the ship did. Number 3. The Hjortspring Warboat. A Danish bog gave up a boat built for 80 men, and the weapons of all 80, and none of their bodies. Peat cutters on the island of Als had been turning up worked wood in Hjortspring Bog since the 1880s, but nobody excavated properly until Gustav Rosenberg of the National Museum of Denmark opened the site in 1921. Only about 40% of the boat survived, and it was enough because the boat wasn't alone in that deposit. Alongside it, 138 iron spearheads plus 31 more of bone and antler, 11 single-edged iron swords, 2 of them deliberately bent double. The remains of roughly 50 measurable shields, with fragments suggesting many more. A bellows tube and a smith's tools, wooden bowls, boxes, plates, and spoons, and the butchered remains of a horse, a lamb, a calf, and 2 dogs. That's equipment for something like 80 fighting men. And no human remains from that force at all. The likely reading: a raiding party was destroyed, and its gear was carried out to the lake and deliberately given away. 80 men is roughly 4 boats of this type. Only one of them went into the water. The boat itself runs 19mm overall, a 13.6mm hull with a 2mm beam, drawing about 30 cm and weighing near 500 kilos, less than a small car, for a 19-meter warship. It's built from 5 planks of lime, 1 broad bottom plank, 1 side plank, and 1 gunwale plank on each side, tapering from 3 cm down to 1.5. A carved stem block closes each end. The planks are sewn together with lime bass cord, 3 to 4 mm thick. 10 internal frames sit inside, hazel branches lashed to cleats carved straight out of the solid planking, and 2 curved horns project about 2 meters beyond each end. There is no metal anywhere in the hull, not a rivet, not a nail. 22 to 24 men paddled it with maple paddles. There was no sail. What makes Hjortspring genuinely extraordinary right now, in 2026, is that its date is still moving. In December 2025, Mikkel Fauvel of Lund University and Fleming Cowell of the National Museum published the first direct radiocarbon date this boat has ever had, and it's taken from the lime bass cordage, since the planks themselves couldn't be dated at all after earlier conservation treatments contaminated them. The cord returned 2,195 years before present, calibrating to somewhere between 381 and 161 BC. The familiar figure of 350 BC, repeated everywhere for the better part of a century, was never a measurement. It was typology. The same study examined the caulking and found a mix of pine pitch and animal tallow. And Denmark's own pine forests had vanished by the Neolithic. On that basis, the team proposed the boat and its crew came from further east in the Baltic, Blekinge, Bornholm, Gotland, or northern Poland. That's an inference from where the resin could have come from, not a measurement on the timber itself, so hold it loosely. It may also be the most interesting idea anyone's had about this boat in 50 years. One more thing turned up in the caulking. A partial human fingerprint pressed into the tar recovered by X-ray tomography. The lineage claim needs care here too. This is the oldest surviving plank-built boat in Northern Europe, and the earliest physical evidence for the tradition that eventually produced the Viking ship. But it is not a Viking ship. It's sewn, not riveted, paddled, not rowed. The iron rivet that defines true clinker construction doesn't appear for another 5 centuries, and Bronze Age rock art already shows double-ended horned craft like this one, which suggests this hull is the oldest survivor, not the origin point. A replica Tilia Alzi was launched in 1999 by a local guild on Als. The National Museum cites a sprint speed around 8 knots, though the guild's own crews say they never got above 4.1, and that their paddling was the limit, not the boats. What's left in Copenhagen is a hull, a small massacre's worth of equipment, and no instructions at all. 5 planks of lime, 3mm of bass string, no metal, and a brutal quantities of skill nobody ever wrote down. The boat survived. The method that built it went into the ground with the men who lost it. All that's left of a single builder is 1 fingerprint, pressed into a smear of pitch. Number 2. The ship buried beside the Great Pyramid. A hole was drilled through a limestone block beside the Great Pyramid, and the smell of cedar came rising up out of 4,500 years of darkness. In May 1954, the Egyptian Antiquities Service was clearing debris along the south face of the pyramid at Giza when Kamal el-Malak, working with Inspector Zaki Noor, found a line of massive limestone blocks set into a ledge cut straight into the bedrock. On May 26th, a hole was drilled through one of them. 7 boat pits are now known around the pyramid complex. 2 lie along the south face, and the eastern one mattered most. 41 limestone blocks roofed it, each weighing somewhere between 17 and 20 tons. One early description compared them to the keys of a dilapidated piano. Underneath was a ship, taken entirely to pieces. 1 through 124 separate components, stacked in 13 successive layers, organized into more than 600 groups, not dumped, but sorted in an order that reflected exactly how the vessel had come apart. Every single piece had a place. Putting it back together fell to Ahmed Youssef Mustafa, chief restorer of the Antiquities Department, and took him more than a decade. Accounts range from 10 to 16 years. What emerged is 43.5 meter long, 5.9 centimeters in the beam, drawing under 1.5 meters. The planking is cedar of Lebanon, imported, with acacia used alongside it and tenons cut from cedar wood. And here is where the ship becomes genuinely hard to explain. It's built shell first. Its planks joined edge to edge with mortise and tenon, joints that are not pegged at all. They're bound with rope of halfa grass, threaded through V-shaped channels drilled into the inner faces so that no lashing shows on the outside. There is no metal in it, no pegs, no true keel. The hull is held shut entirely by knots. The likely explanation, a reading, not a demonstration, is that wet timber swells against its own lashings and pulls its own seams tighter from the inside. The wetter the wood gets, the tighter the boat gets. The shape itself is older than the materials. The profile is papyriform, an upswept reed bundle boat complete with papyrus umbel finials at bow and stern, reproduced here in imported cedar at 43 meters, a scale reeds could never actually reach. The Egyptians were building a Nile reed craft out of Lebanese timber, copying a form that belongs to a period long before anyone in Egypt was writing anything down at all. Which is why a ship from a fully literate kingdom belongs on this list in the first place. Whether it ever actually floated is unresolved and openly argued. Some accounts report rope impressions and marks consistent with wood that had been wet and swollen. Others report no waterline staining whatsoever and argue it was built purely for the burial and never launched at all. Its purpose is equally open. A solar bark for the king's journey, a funerary barge that carried his body, a pilgrimage vessel. The disturbing part is that a hull this sophisticated was deliberately disassembled and sealed into a hole in the ground, with no strong reason to think anyone ever expected it to come out again. It came out twice. On the night of August 6, 2021, the reassembled ship was moved to the Grand Egyptian Museum, sealed inside a shock-absorbing steel container on a remote-controlled transporter brought in from Belgium. 20 tons of ancient cedar, covering 8 to 10 kilometers in 10 hours at walking pace. And the second boat is still being born, the Western Pit, known since 1954 but left alone for decades because its wood was in poor condition, was finally fully extracted by an Egyptian and Japanese mission under Sakuji Yoshimura of Waseda University in June 2021, yielding around 1,300 pieces from 13 layers. On December 23, 2025, assembly began in public view in front of visitors inside the Khufu Boat Hall, expected to take up to 4 years. The ship you can walk past at Giza today has now been taken apart and put back together twice, 4,500 years apart, and both times someone had to work out the order purely from the pieces. It went into the ground as a kit. It's the only vessel on this list built to come apart on purpose, and we found it still in pieces. Number 1, the fleet. Nobody has ever found. Every boat on this list is younger than 10,000 years. This one is at least 6 times older than the oldest of them. And it has left no wood, no rope, no paddle, not one splinter anywhere on Earth. Go back to Majid Bibi, a rock shelter on Myrar country in western Arnhem Land. In 2017, Chris Clarkson and 27 colleagues published the results in Nature, working with the permission of the Myrar senior traditional owners, placing people in northern Australia 65,000 years ago. The dating rests on 56 luminescent samples and 22 radiocarbon dates run through a Bayesian model, and the lowest artifact layer alone produced more than 10,000 stone tools in place, including the world's oldest edge-ground hatchets. The date is contested, and legitimately so. Luminescence only dates the last time a grain of sand saw daylight, not the tool lying beside it. James O'Connell, Jim Allen, and colleagues argued in 2018 that any age over 50,000 years here is unlikely to hold up. A separate team argued in 2021 that termite activity had churned the deposit and manufactured false stone layers. The excavators tested that directly rather than dismissing it. Ben Marwick's team trampled artifacts into the actual Majid-Bebe sediment and measured how far they moved. Median displacement, 1.66 cm, nothing refit across the gap between the disputed bands. The ground shifted again at Laili in Timor-Leste, where sediment was quietly accumulating between 59,000 and 54,000 years ago, with nobody in the shelter at all. And in November 2025, a study of mitochondrial genomes put the founding lineage at 60,000 to 63,000 years. The exact date is still live. The geography underneath it is not. Reaching Australia and New Guinea from Southeast Asia, even at the lowest sea level anyone reconstructs, required a minimum of 5 separate water crossings, and that only gets you to the final launch point. At least one leg on the southern route approached 100 km. The modeling here is merciless. There's line of sight visibility island to island for the earlier legs. For the final crossing into Sahul, there's none at all. They could not see where they were going. What they could see on a clear day was smoke from lightning-struck fires on land they couldn't otherwise make out at all, and birds crossing overhead on a migration that had to start somewhere. And then there's the arithmetic of simply surviving the trip. Corey Bradshaw and colleagues modeled the minimum population needed to found a viable colony, somewhere between 1,300 and 1,150 people, arriving either all at once or across repeated voyages of at least 130 people, sustained over 7 to 9 centuries. Genomic estimates run lower, and the two figures are measuring different things, but either version rules out an accident entirely. You do not get near the 300 people or 130 people arriving again and again for 8 centuries straight by drifting off course. There is real evidence for the skill involved, just none for the boat itself. At Asataukuru in Timor-Leste, Sue O'Connor's excavation produced more than 38,000 fish bones, including deep water tuna dated to 42,000 years ago, plus a shellfish hook made sometime between 23,000 and 16,000 years ago. Catching tuna is not shoreline fishing, it's open water out of sight of land with real tackle. So where's the boat? There is no paddle, no hull fragment, not one piece of Pleistocene cordage anywhere on the entire Australian continent. The reasons are unglamorous and complete. Organic material needs cold, wet, airless burial to survive 10,000 years, and the tropics almost never provide it. Worse, the coastline they actually launched from is gone. Sea level then stood about 130 meters lower than it does now. More than 2 million square kilometers of Sahul went underwater, close to a fifth of the whole continent. On the northwest shelf alone, 400,000 kilometers of habitable land drowned, more than 1.5 times the area of the United Kingdom. Every beach where those holes were shaped and dragged into the water now sits somewhere under the Timor and Arafura seas. We know the record is still down there because a little of it has already been recovered. Off Murujuga in Western Australia, divers found 269 stone artifacts sitting in a submerged channel in Holocene material, proving the ground itself is intact and reachable. Almost nobody has looked yet. That's what makes this the most unsettling entry on the whole list. Every other object here is something you can physically stand in front of. Pine in Asin, mahogany in Demeturu, oak in Dover, tar in a Kuwaiti storeroom, cedar at Giza. This one is an absence with an entire continent attached to it, but it isn't a story about people who vanished. The ancestors of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples made that crossing, and genetic evidence shows their continuous presence in the same regions ever since, on the order of 50,000 years, among the longest unbroken connections between a people and a place, documented anywhere on Earth. The voyage didn't end. It arrived, and it stayed. Every hull on this entire countdown sits downstream of it. The stitched oak, the bossed cord, the bitumen skin, the pegged tenons, the cedar, folded into a pit at Giza. All of it descending from a capability that already existed tens of thousands of years earlier and left behind not one splinter of proof. The oldest boat we can actually point to is 3 meters of pine in a Dutch display case. The first one was launched off a beach that's now under the Arafura Sea, and it was already good enough to carry a population across water where nobody could see the far side.